Welcome to Science for Hire with your host, Dr. Charles Handler. Science for Hire provides 30 minutes of enlightenment on best practices and news from the front lines of the employment testing universe.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Science for Hire. I am your host, Dr. Charles Handler, and I have an amazing guest here today whom I've actually known for a pretty long time, but never really connected on professionally and technically. So I'll talk about that a little bit, but I am going to go ahead and let Karin Golde, who is the, founder of West Valley AI, right? And a longtime veteran of Silicon Valley AI stuff. And I'll let her talk about that because she's got a pretty interesting background in, I believe, linguistics, right?
Yeah, I did recently found West Valley AI as a consulting firm for organizations who are building roadmaps or planning implementations of AI, and especially setting up strategies for language data, which I think is one of the most tricky parts about AI is dealing with language data. And like you said, it's something I've had a lot of experience with. I got my Ph.D. in linguistics way back when, and I've been working at various startups, leading up teams of data scientists and computational linguists to build enterprise software. And then more recently, I was at Amazon. I was on the AI data team. I was leading a team of what we call language engineers there to prepare the data needed for training the kinds of services that AWS has for human language technologies like transcription, translation, chatbots, things like that. So no, I'm excited to be here. I'm also a longtime fan of IO psychology, so I kind of married into the field, and
Literally.
yeah. So honestly, like over the years, as I've led teams, I've always gone to my IO friends for advice on proper hiring and assessment and management techniques. So really, really excited to have a conversation about the intersection of those two things.
Yeah, for sure. So before we do that, let's personalize it a little. I mean, I've known your husband Mark for a long time. We've worked together. Great guy, IO psychologist, educator now, and so it's funny because I've known you and we've hung out, but I knew you were a PhD in linguistics, right? I believe you're like fluent in Japanese, right? And I thought
Now the rumors
no?
are really flying. No.
Oh no, I thought you were.
I was an East Asian Studies minor, and I did take 3
Okay.
years of Japanese, but far from fluent. Yeah.
Oh, you're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say Konnichiwa.
Yeah, konnichiwa. It's actually, I will say though that like studying Japanese for so long, I've also studied German a lot. I do speak German like fairly well, and and it's just other languages. It is important when you're a linguist to really have tried to get a feel for a number of languages, even if you can't really speak them, just to
Right.
get a sense of the diversity. It's funny because AI is a very English centric field, maybe like secondarily Chinese, but a lot of the kind of techniques that have been built up over the years kind of start with English as a starting point and then kind of branch out into other languages. But it's better to think about language more holistically before you dive into things. Yeah.
And I never really even connected, artificial intelligence or even data science, whatever, linguistics. I never really connected those two, but now it's all about that. And maybe when you started in your field, even though machine learning and those kind of things had been around, I don't know, were you studying this kind of stuff in a more embryonic state back then, or were you looking at completely different things related to language?
Yeah, well, this is kind of a good intro, I think, for like the evolution of AI, right? It's sort of
Right.
when I was in grad school, I studied theoretical syntax and semantics, and that is the field of how what is the underlying structure of language and how do those structures support meaning. When you're a linguist, especially a syntactician, when you look at language, it's kind of different from how other people look at language. You kind of like see the structures under it, kind of have this X-ray vision, right, of what's going on under the hood. But at this, but it is very mysterious, and there's lots of different interesting phenomena to discover. But I will say, like in grad school, like I said, theoretical, but still, the kind of models that we were working with were computationally implementable. So my first job out of grad school was at a company that was implementing a parser in the same framework that I had been studying. So basically this machine system, AI system, I guess you could say, we didn't call it that back then because it wasn't in fashion at the time, but would take a sentence and then just output what the structure of that sentence was, how all the different components broke down and related to each other. So at that time, AI was really more about trying to understand the structure of language similar to how maybe humans do, and do more of an expert system type approach of saying, like, okay, these are the patterns that map onto this kind of output that we want. And in this case, we were doing automated email responses. So given the way that this, email kind of breaks down at a syntactic and semantic level, we want to map this onto a certain action that the customer service rep needs to take, whether it's tracking an order or changing a password or whatever. So that was kind of like a lot of AI, which still is around, still exists. A lot of rules-based expert systems are still kind of either components or even main components of systems today. But that was the transition.
Well, lay people, might just think linguistics means foreign languages, right? Like, it's interesting because that's kind of how I thought about it, even until I learned a little bit more. So I'm very used to, and I probably carry this to other places, even like when we've been hanging out in the past. Here in New Orleans, where I've been for a while, one of the most interesting things is that people that you meet, they don't ask you what you do. There's people I know that I have no clue what they do, and I rarely get asked. And when I do say, oh, I'm a psychologist or organizational psychologist, you can imagine the first thing people say, oh, you're going to analyze me, or oh, I'm too crazy, don't analyze me, or just assuming that I'm a clinical psychologist and that's what I do, which I understand, So that's interesting. So I don't do that a lot in other situations. And it was just recently I was out in the Bay Area. I went out there to see one of my favorite bands, Devo, with your husband and your son, which is,
Yep.
I think, his first real legit concert, which is amazing. And that was just an amazing experience, I'll say. Like, I felt like watching that band go through like most of their, well, they have a huge catalog, but most of the things I just want to stop and say, like, how much I really feel what their message is profound, in that, like, they are basically saying, how I interpret it, everything is bonkers and it's getting more bonkers and we're just devolving into just insanity. But at the same time, it's beautiful and we have to embrace it and just make the best out of it, even though even though we cannot make sense out of what's happening very much. It's our reality, and we got to love it and enjoy it and just maximize our experience with it. I think that's a good, especially as things are getting wonkier and wonkier and people are behaving more strangely. So anyway, that's an aside, but
well, yeah, I will say, like, Devo kind of crafted that message in the 1970s, right? And
yes.
somehow it's remained relevant, and I think it was probably relevant before their time too. So no, it's easy to look back on history and think, like, well, that all kind of made sense and it sort of worked out. But yeah, when we're in the thick of things like AI right now, it's overwhelming. I agree.
Oh
And we just have
gosh,
to make
yeah.
the best of it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so we got a chance to hang out, and you've now started kind of your own journey, and I've been doing that in various ways for a long time. So it's good to be able to compare notes, and because we're somewhat similar situation, and we've been doing that a lot, but really just starting to have the dialogue about what's happening now in the world of artificial intelligence, computer science, whatever. It's beyond exciting for me. Like, I really enjoy it. So we had some good conversations. I learned a lot, and that's really my agenda here on the show too, is to learn. So as we've been talking, we're coming from different backgrounds. I think we both understand one another's disciplines, and we basically are looking to extend our knowledge and do new things, right? I feel like there's kind of a convergence as we talk about it, and you're interested in IO topics and applications, and I'm interested in applying artificial intelligence to our discipline. It's really the multidisciplinary approach that I think we're really going to need, or is actually happening, to be able to help these technologies work within industries, within scenarios, whatever it is, right? Because one of us alone isn't going to be able to pull it off. And I guess that's probably been the case for a long time, but it seems, magnified now. And as we start talking about things, we're starting to converge on certain points, which we'll talk about in a little while. But I think it's good to back up. And I've seen some really great presentations and materials you've done on large language models, or AI for dummies, or just kind of simplifying things in an eloquent and concise way. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about, for me, it's all about large language models and the GPTs and all that good stuff. So lead us to where we are now, maybe a little bit in terms of the world of artificial intelligence, so we can kind of and personalize that with what you're doing around data sets, because I think that's the molecules, I would say, of this stuff, right? The atoms, and actually the atoms more than the molecules. And so that's what we've got to start with. The quality of everything we do depends on how our data is managed, right? So there you go.
Yeah.
Have at it.
Sure thing. Yeah, so I think it is helpful to talk about a couple different kinds of AI first, just to situate the conversation. And 90s, early 2000s were really still about these expert systems, especially when it comes to actual production systems, in enterprise software. And the next phase really was more around, I think, especially in the kinds of disciplines we're talking about, is it was around supervised machine learning, which means giving a specific kind of algorithm a bunch of examples of what it's supposed to do. Identify the cats versus the dogs, identify positive, negative, neutral sentiment. Kind of do these sort of classification tasks and other related tasks. But that's kind of what a lot of it boils down to. As far as data sets go, you can imagine, to give it all those kinds of examples of how you want your system to work, you need some kind of human judgment, right? Some kind of human in the loop to create that data for the training, and then also to do the end evaluation and iterate on improvements and so forth. So you can kind of think of that phase, which we're still very much in, and none of these phases goes away, right? They just all kind of build on each other and create more and more complex systems. So these machine learning systems were generally combined with expert systems in some way, and now we're kind of getting into the generative AI phase, which is where on the surface, it feels a lot more magical. So rather than,
Right.
And I will say, AI always refers to what seems magical now.
Nice. I like it.
That's my definition of AI.
I love it. What seems magical now? Because GPT seems effing magical. Every time I use it, I'm just blown away, and I'm using it for so many different things, and I'll say it a million times to whoever listen, right? We've had all kinds of faddish things. Even 3 or 4 years ago, people were talking about AI. I remember going to HR Tech. Every vendor had, AI plastered on their stuff. This was probably just machine learning, natural language processing
What do
stuff.
you mean? Okay, well, hold on now, Charles. What do you mean just machine
I know.
learning and natural
I thought that in my
see?
head. No, I just thought it in my head. It's not just. It's. You read
you
my.
You all get
mind.
bored so easily.
I almost corrected myself.
Jaded.
I know, right? So it is a fantastical thing that's done amazing things. But
thank you.
But and then you've got I don't know, blockchain, metaverse. These are all valuable things, but they have not had the profound impact on changing things that this has. And it's always the fad and the hype, and so I hate it. I'm not a hype guy, but when I find something I believe in, I hype it. And I'm hyping this stuff, and nobody even notices because everybody is. But anyway.
Yeah, I think you get more luck being noticed if you're on the other side of the hype.
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, the reason it seems magical is because, I mean, first of all, these are like general purpose, generative systems, and of course there's image and now video as well. I'm kind of going to be centered on language data in this conversation, but some of what I'm saying is relevant to other things as
Sure,
well.
sure.
But yeah, it's just trained, like, probably people know a few of the basics, right? It's trained on a huge corpus, which is largely scraped from the internet.
The internet, yes.
Also, like books and other kind of just digitized text, right? And from that, it just learns to predict the next word, right? So it's a probability engine where whatever the next probable word is, that's what it's going to output. So that's what large language models are in a nutshell. Now that's kind of just the original pre-training is what I'm describing, though. And I think what a lot of people don't realize that there's a huge next stage. To make that actually useful, you have to actually do a lot more training. And that means feeding it examples. In the case of a system like ChatGPT, it means feeding it a lot of examples of what does a question look like and what does a good answer to that question look like. Thousands of those examples, right? At least.
At
Across.
least.
Yeah. I mean, across all kinds of subcategories and of types of questions, there's a whole taxonomy of the kinds of questions that you expect these kinds of chatbots to be able to handle. So there's all that kind of fine tuning, and then there's a second stage even where humans have to kind of review and rank the output of the model, because the model, since it's probabilistic, can do multiple outputs. So you kind of train it, so you're constantly sort of nudging the weights in a way that the next predicted word ends up being something that is helpful, harmless, and truthful. Is kind of the triumvirate of how these things are trained. So I think, this is the kind of stuff I've worked on right earlier at Amazon. I was, my team was doing a lot of the data for large language models and of course, a lot of the data sets for other kinds of like supervised models as well. And I think this is what's led to a really strong interest of mine in the role of human judgment in an AI creation, because it doesn't just magically know this stuff. Humans have
Yes.
to put all kinds of work into this. So and I will just kind of like take this opportunity to say, we have an ethical data supply chain problem in AI where we have gotten used to kind of getting very, very cheap labor to do this kind of work. And there's not a lot of labor protections for the kind of people who do this. They either do it as gig workers, logging onto a platform, or they do it as contractors working for a vendor that the tech company engages with. But either way, there's a
Well, let's talk about this real quickly because I haven't
sure.
ever thought about that, right? So the immediate thing that comes to my mind is kind of a parallel, and then we could talk about like what does this actually mean, because I don't think people focus on this a lot. But if you think about lithium, right? Lithium's used in a lot of EV batteries and stuff. I don't know how much, and there's a really cool thing. I don't know if you've ever read the Atlas of AI. I can't
I
remember the
have. That's a
owner.
great
Yeah,
book. Yes.
yeah. So I can't remember the author's name, but she talks about lithium in there. And the lithium, it's dirty. I mean, you're using it for clean energy, but you've got people in Africa like just destroying the environment on an individual basis and then selling the lithium to a middleman who sells it to big corporations. So the lithium is clean. Nobody really knows where it comes from. It's used to make clean things, but it's absolutely decimating the area where you're mining it. So, and people don't think about that when they're driving around in their EVs or using their power drills or whatever, taking their bipolar medicine, whatever that is. But I feel like maybe we've got the same problem in AI. I never thought about that. And even not only that, I don't think people stop and really consider at all where the hell does this data come from? Even me say, oh, it's trained on a corpus. We trained it on the internet. Well, I don't see in my mind a human being involved in that. I just see some technology being told, go get this stuff. So tell us a little bit more about the very foundational level. Where in the hell does the data this thing's trained on or these things trained on come from? In the large language model sense, in the more open sense,
Yeah, and I think your lithium example is good. And it is one of these things where we tend to kind of divert attention away from
Right.
some difficult truths about this. But yeah, I would say as far as where the data comes from, I mean, obviously, like Google has indexed the internet, large portions of the internet for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of accepted that to a certain degree, what's on the internet is free game for certain types of fair use. Although even Google has kind of gotten some flack over the years for putting too much information straight on google.com so people don't click through. But this kind of takes it to another level that I think has made some people very uncomfortable. At scale, it feels like it's kind of piggybacking on a lot of work that people did and are not compensated for, especially if it's professional work, professional writing, news journalists and things like that. So, I think that is going to be obviously is a lot of lawyers talking about it right now, and I don't have any like kind of legal opinion on it, but I think it's kind of an interesting ethical question that I don't have an answer for. Is it okay or is it not okay? I think that the second thing to consider though is, what does this data represent? Because we tend to think of the internet as being like, oh, well, that's like a mirror of the world, right? Like
Right,
everything that
right.
happens in real life gets reflected on the internet. And so that's kind of a good proxy for who we are as humans. And
Oh, ouch. Okay.
yeah, but it's not really, right? Because, I
No.
mean, for one thing, like I said, the AI has always been fairly English centric. The internet is fairly English centric with, a pretty large groups of other languages kind of following behind, but it definitely does not, it's not proportional to who we are as a species,
Yeah, yeah,
globally
yeah.
speaking, right? And so that's kind of one issue, is that it's not really representative of us as a whole. So people are going to kind of receive differential benefits from it.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is that, like, as we know, the internet tends to bring out the worst in us in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Yeah.
And so, some of the when these models get trained, there is some attempt made to kind of clean out the dregs of the internet, I guess, the 4chans of the world. But where all the hate speech is and all the gross
Right,
stuff
right,
is.
right.
But it's not really practical to do that. And even if you get kind of the worst of it out there, there's still really interesting kind of biases that end up, the data is skewed in certain ways. So yeah, so that's kind of like, the pre-training data, which just, doesn't involve a whole lot of human labor, to be honest. Like I said, some attempts at cleaning, but it's not usually where the focus is. So
Gotcha. Gotcha.
so that's
Ah,
kind of the first big stage.
right. Okay. So you're leading me to knowledge, but first I want to say, when you're talking about that, the image I had in my mind, my very favorite New Yorker cartoon of all time, which I just looked at something that ranked all the most liked or most, and this was one of them. So it's not just me, but and this one's like 20 years old, but it's a dog sitting in front of a computer. Have you seen that one?
Oh, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
I love
yeah,
that. And did you know
that's a
that?
classic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I submitted a cartoon to New Yorker. I think you can't really, expect to get it done. But I found a guy that does illustrations, right? So because I can't draw it, so I had him do it for like $50 or something. I submitted it, but I think it's great. I'll give you the visual. So and I was at my mom's place, and there's guest towels in there, and it's my old bathroom when I was a kid. I'm like, nobody's probably touched this guest towel in 20 years. So my thing is, it's when guest towels dream, and it's a guest towel sitting on the bar, but it's got a fantasy, bubble, and he's a beach towel with like he's on the beach with a lady in a bikini laying on there holding a drink under an umbrella, right? Because beach towels, like they're not even achieving their purpose of actually
Yeah.
like drying anybody or doing anything. And there's other towels that are out there having all kinds of fun in the world. So
I,
anyway,
I do like that, Charles.
yeah,
Yes,
they
that's
didn't
it's
they
good.
didn't accept it as far as I know, but I'm gonna get this year for the holidays. I'm getting copies of it for all my relatives to go on their wall, so at least somebody will see it. Anyway, digression, but so I'm getting down to the point in my notes here. I'm like, well, what about this low wage labor, because if you're just pulling this off the internet, there's no low wage labor. Blah. So tell us about that next step of it sounds like these people are classifying and training things so that the model knows what relates to what kind of thing. Tell
Yeah.
us about that and how that
Yeah,
works.
yeah. So I mean, this has been going on for years as we've been building these predictive models. You need to have. So I'll just give you an example from my own work history, which is that I was for a good 10 years. I was a company called NetBase, which is now called Quid, doing social media analytics, and that involved a lot of sentiment classification.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So at a high level, a brand would be able to log on to our platform, see all like the social media posts and news posts about them, but then also see kind of aggregate metrics about it, because no one's going to want to read through all of it, right? So one of the aggregate metrics was how do people feel about your brand? What are the opinions towards your brand? And in order to basically check how well our system was working and get things oriented in the right direction, I got a lot of social media posts labeled for sentiment. Is this, I drink Coke? Is this positive, negative, or neutral for the brand Coke? And so forth. Just tens of thousands of these
Right.
I did over the years. It was a matter of putting this stuff up on a platform. I used a platform called Appen, and on that platform people would just see kind of like the survey, right, like a little like multiple choice question for each of these things, and they would get paid what I tried to make it work out to something like at least minimum US wage, because I was really targeting US workers for this thing. But there was really no floor. Like there was no like minimum wage that I had to pay them on the platform. I could pay them like as little as I possibly could, and people would still do the work. So it wasn't that I had to attract workers with a certain wage. You could really go rock bottom and they would still do the
Where
work.
are they located? Are these people in offshore, basically?
They're all over the place, and you can there's a lot in India and the Philippines and East Africa. I was actually narrowing it down to, I think, US and Canada, because I was looking for sentiment on brands, which is somewhat subjective and requires some cultural knowledge. Yeah, so I was really kind of but you can, like, especially if it's like classifying images of cats and dogs, there are some things that are not that don't really require cultural knowledge. You
Yeah,
can
yeah.
you can
Mm,
outsource to other places.
interesting.
But yeah, I mean, this required things like having automated quality controls, because obviously people built bots to try to scam these
Yeah, yeah.
systems. People would, you could just like answer the same question, and the same, you
Right.
could put
Like
positive
you
on
said,
everything and
no
be done,
quality
right?
control.
So
Christmas tree, like I used to
no
say.
quality control.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's obviously something that you have to have mechanisms to deal with. And so on this particular platform, what you do is you have kind of a little training and assessment portion at the beginning. So they take a little test quiz as a gating factor. But then, to make sure that they're continuing to do good work as they go along, you have on each page a hidden test question where you've already manually put in the correct answer. And then if they get it wrong, it pops up you got this wrong
Mm-hmm.
thing, and it lowers their score. And if they fall below a certain threshold, which is usually like 70 or 80% accuracy on these test questions, then they just get automatically kicked off
Right.
the job.
Proctoring or
Yeah.
like slacker control, basically, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that actually works pretty well if you create your test questions well. It turns out that it's actually really hard to create really foolproof test questions that aren't also super easy, because you do want to make them a little tricky to make sure that people are paying attention to the finer points of the guidelines. And so you have to constantly walk this line. And if you let people get things wrong, even though it was really a problem with your own test question, what happens is that their reputation scores go down on the platform, and then they're not able to access like some higher paying jobs, because people tend to get put in tiers according to their work quality.
Interesting.
Yeah, so you can pay more for people who have had higher reputation scores. So there's all kinds of implications for their own livelihoods, and there's really no recourse,
Yeah.
right? They can send you a little message that says this wasn't
Right.
fair, and I actually read those messages and responded to them, but I suspect there a lot of people didn't, and or don't, and there's not really any requirement to do
Interesting.
that. So it's basically what you got is just this huge power imbalance, right? Where you're dealing with people who are anonymous to you. And therefore, you're like even less incentivized to care about them and how much they're getting paid and
Yeah.
what their experience is
Yeah.
like. And that goes for both this kind of platform that I'm describing, and then also, cases where you have vendors who are working with teams of contractors that they've engaged. There's kind of a tendency to throw things over the wall and just let the vendor deal with it. So I will say that this has been coming to people's attention more. There was a news story that got repeated quite a bit, I think, about the Kenyan workers last year who were working on OpenAI projects. They were working actually for a vendor called Sama, and so they were doing toxicity classification, which is especially rough because it means looking at a whole bunch of text or sometimes images. In this case, it was text, but it's basically like a content moderation job where you're like, identifying graphic abuse and and hate speech and just kind of a lot of disturbing, gross stuff that falls into a variety of categories. I think that the news stories tended to focus on the fact that they were being paid $2 a day, which actually wasn't really the issue. The issue was more that they were led to believe that they wouldn't be working such long hours on this thing and that they would be getting psychological support for it, and those things didn't materialize. So it was very traumatic, and the people the people who spoke out about it from the workforce said it was like torture doing this kind of work. And so OpenAI ended up canceling the contract early just because things went so sideways. But this is the kind of thing that can happen when you really don't think about people as people, and you're kind of trying to avoid the reality that AI is really built off of the judgment and the knowledge and intelligence of thousands and thousands of humans. Actually, I should say millions. There's millions of people who do this kind of work.
The first thing I think of is like, well, the pyramids were built by slaves of my people, and this amazing advanced thing is being built by almost that. And so, we talked about earlier with lithium. Well, you just said Kenya. I mean, that's where the lithium mining is going on. So I'm sure there's other places besides Kenya,
Mm-hmm.
but again, starting to, for whatever it's worth, make these connections. But really what you're talking about here, apart from the human rights issue, which is significant, is garbage in, garbage out, right? We've been talking about that for a long time.
Right.
I don't know. ChatGPT's been giving me some pretty amazing stuff to think it was built on garbage, but that's not really what we're talking about. So it's all about the quality of the data, right? And that's like your department. And I think you're really putting a stake in the ground, saying, we've got to recognize and really steward this stuff in a way that it's going to make everything that's already really great way better, way more accurate. Because the bias and the things that are problematic with these things, not from the human rights standpoint, which I think it's really great that you brought that up and talked about it, because I honestly don't think that a lot of people, we just take it for granted that the data, that this stuff just came from somewhere, from Silicon Valley, from some smart people. They just put it all together, and it's not like that at all. But let's transition a little bit. I mean, we started talking about kind of some commonalities. We had a conversation where I was telling you, oh yeah, I'm doing my first, like I'm taking some prompt engineering, an online prompt engineering class, and I want to apply my first little project to taking qualitative interviews that I've done, and looking for trends in those interviews using GPT. And you asked me, well, how did I do it before? And I said, well, I just coded it manually. And then you were like, well, why don't you build a train a model to do that for you? It'd be a lot more efficient for you. And I'm like, well, I only do it like this particular scenario. I'm only doing it once. I don't know how to build models. GPT is one of those. It's the Windows instead of DOS, or the Windows instead of punch cards or whatever, that people don't have to know. Like when I started grad school, I was doing very poorly in statistics because I had to program SPSS into the mainframe. And then halfway through the semester, the first GUI SPSS came out, and I started getting A's because I didn't have to worry about programming, right? So, because they're not the same skill set, stats but I was caught in a morass of inadequacy in terms of being a programmer. So it's that kind of kind of a thing, right? And so I just want the easy, I want to press the button, and that's where we're headed with all this stuff, is agents that combine a bunch of different bots to do something for you. Not Alexa, turn on the lights, but Alexa, hire me a database engineer to work in Poughkeepsie or whatever, right? So I guess what I'm getting at is I'm a simpleton in this stuff. You've got a lot of tools and experience, and so we started talking about, well, what would it look like, Charles, if you wanted to build some models to do things? And I just kind of got into what that's all about, and back to machine learning, which is really, I think, the more accessible. I mean, I'm guessing large language models are all running on it's all machine learning, is it not? Or am I starting to bastardize
Yeah,
things?
yeah. No. You're right. It's all machine learning. Yeah, just different
Right.
types of
So
models.
we come together on, okay, well, what kind of things in IO psychology could these models do? What's feasible? You sent me an article which I hadn't seen from Mike Campion. He's actually been a guest on the podcast, and for PsyOp, I was a voter on the Distinguished Career Award, and he was nominated, and it was like a unanimous thing. Like he's a stud in our field for sure. It's a really great article. I think it's a personnel psychology special edition. If you can get a hold of that, I'll put a link in the show notes when I'm done with that to the article. But we started to just talk about, well, what's needed, what's feasible, etc. So I'm gonna let you talk now. Like, for someone like me, what is someone like you able to do? What could we do together to help advance my field, I guess? Is that a too broad of a question? I don't know. I'm serving it up for you to say whatever you want, really, right here.
Yeah. So what can AI do for IO psychology? What can AI do for
Yeah.
IO? Yeah. The Campion article was really interesting to me too. I want to give credit to Cole Napper at when his
Yep.
Directionally Correct podcast, because that's
I've
where
been
I
on
learned
that
about
one.
it.
I've been a guest on that. I love it. It's a
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. So I think it did a great job of breaking down all the different kinds of areas where AI is relevant or maybe not quite ready or not appropriate, or all kinds of sort of analysis of that. And so I had a couple of takeaways that, from my perspective, were interesting. One is that they seem to think that there's still a lot of value in just deriving insights from text. And what I mean by that is, if you're running some kind of data analysis, a lot of times you're working with structured data, and then it's relatively straightforward. But if you're dealing with, survey results, free text fields, it can be difficult to map that to something that you can use as like basically a feature, right, for your model. And so that's what you're doing, is coding that up
Right.
by hand. If that code, the taxonomy of things that you're mapping to, changes every time, then that's kind of, then yeah, you aren't going to really, it doesn't make sense to build a whole model for that. And so it's kind of interesting to me that it does change so much. Like, I would think that there would be some kind of like, standard set of labels or something that you would be working off of.
Yeah, well, I'm asking one, it's one survey with a specific set of questions that I probably won't repeat again because it's a research project, to summarize what IO
Mm-hmm.
psychologists in enterprise are doing with technology or whatever, right? If it were a job analysis interview,
Mm-hmm.
tell me about your job, what's a typical day on the job, what tasks do you do, then for sure it would be worth it. I mean, there's tons of types of interviews and things that we
Mm-hmm.
do that would be useful. But I think for me, it's really, well, let's just skip to what I feel like. Remember the concept, I think back in the early 2000s, like the first internet boom, there was that term killer app, right? What's the next killer app? The thing that's going to
Yeah.
just, make
Mm-hmm.
everything else look silly, whatever. Well, to me, the killer app in our field has been scoring basically qualitative data, responses to questions, but even more like assessment center exercises, complex sets of information where an expert would have to be trained and use tools to synthesize that information and digest it and come up with a recommendation or a score or something like that. That has been it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy to do, right? And so you can't scale that. Well, to me, the biggest unlock for our field of hiring and coaching and develop whatever it is about people, is being able to take all that in a artificial intelligence and come up with the same answers a human rater who was well trained would do, because that unlocks a lot of scale and a lot of new opportunities.
Right. So theoretically, yeah, I mean theoretically that should be possible and potentially even straightforward, although once you look at the data, nothing's straightforward. So I think that if enough experts have already labeled enough data, then that's great training and test data for a supervised machine learning model. So like one place to start is just there and see how well that works, or how well you can generalize across different or like related use cases to really scale it up. Now, one thing though is that suppose actually what you're describing breaks down into, I don't know, like 10 different use cases that really need 10 different models created, or 20 different models, but it's still kind of worth it because it's going to be repeated. The more data that you need labeled, it can be difficult because like the situations I was describing before, you're outsourcing to people who may or may not have certain expertise. Now, there are places that you can go which will provide you with, labelers who have particular expertise, right down to like medical and legal and everything. So it's not that that doesn't exist, but I think that there's interesting ways to kind of scale up this kind of labeling with LLMs, so that you can say, here's a category, here's a definition of that category. Tell me which of these survey results fit in that category. That can be a thing that you do. I think that it's still not going to do as well as a supervised model in a lot of cases, or it might just be overkill because these things can be large and expensive. But if you can use that just to create the training data, just the training labels, get your models going, it can be a great way to bootstrap expertise. So kind of like just kind of like adding some rocket fuel to expert opinion. Experts still need to go through and verify all of this, though. If you just kind of take it from a prompt engineering perspective and say, I'm going to take this very general model and ask it to do exactly what I'm telling it, you're still going to have to go back and evaluate how well it did, right? It's not going to be quite trustworthy enough because, once again, it's a probability engine. It's not specifically trained to do what you're trying to make it do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What you're talking about is the crux of how we need to use this. It's an interaction between the two, with the humans really providing the last mile in some sense, the first mile and the last mile. But so let me give you a scenario, and I want to talk about this scenario in the context of what we've just been talking about. There have been some folks, and I think about it as the level of a vendor. A vendor selling predictive hiring tools, right? If you think about situational judgment exercises, things where people are where they have a lot of choices and they make choices, and even in like a gamified situation, right? There's a professional, like a serious game. People are making choices, and those choices have patterns, and there's an optimal pattern in those choices to score you at the most perfect level. But there's other ways you can go and still score pretty well. And then, of course, you can do terribly. And so in those situations, what you'd have is human raters rating that exercise a bunch of times, right? And they're training. They're the trainers. It's not, someone who's an expert at, or who can classify dogs and cats. It's expert people who've even probably written these things and then have, kind of gone through and said, these are the optimal pathways. I hope I'm not, bastardizing this or hacking it. But then those experts train the system, and then the system uses that training on the data from other folks, right? And so I think that we've seen that be pretty successful. I guess what we're looking for is, well, can we just somehow not have those experts take the time and energy to do that? And can we just have some other system, understand what the optimum pathways are through this maze, essentially, and score people on it, right?
Yeah, and I think you're, as far as like optimal pathways and things like that, you're getting into kind of reinforcement learning algorithms maybe that I'm not as familiar with, so I can't I can't speak to it as well. I can just say that as far as like to the extent that they're judging language, that as opposed to the decisions that people made, that you can kind of bootstrap this again. Like there are systems out there where you can, for example, apply one label to a few different things, and it'll suggest other things that should have that label as well. So it goes a lot faster, and it starts to build up what's called labeling functions. So any text that has this thing in it probably belongs to this category. So you can quickly move through that as a human reviewer, and that's a lot faster than looking at number one, number two, number three, looking at them all individually. So I kind of envision maybe those systems. Like I said, those systems exist. There's companies like Watchful and Snorkel that provide these, what I think are super cool platforms, but maybe just need to be like repurposed a bit or made more accessible to people in a more of a variety of situations. Like your everyday IO psychologist should be able to access this kind of thing.
Yeah, because some of us aren't really good with the programming side of things, but want to achieve things, and it's just we're just making things easier and easier, so that we can get on to the real human work that the artificial intelligence can't do really well. So like taking a lot of the heavy lifting and burdensome tasks away and freeing us up to do more enlightened things, essentially. We've just kept continually doing that with technology. At some point, the technology may turn around and enslave us to do what it wants. I don't know. I feel like we kind of already are slightly in some way, but that's a whole nother podcast. So, I mean, it's what I'm taking away from this too is like, I don't know, it'd be interesting as if there's ever like some kind of a data quality seal. Like we've got to understand that data just doesn't, it's not just falling out of the sky. It has a quality, it has an ethics behind it at the very foundational level. I read something that the CEO of Indeed was saying, well, unless we train, and it's not the exact same thing, but unless the people who are writing our code and are contributing to it are of a diverse background, that in itself, that context is important for understanding that we have code that is more. You're just basically saying the people who are doing all this should be diverse. If you want diversity out of the other end of it, there's no empirical things I could point to for that. But I guess what I'm saying is there's a quality and an ethics when we start talking about ethics of AI. Even the models we see, I haven't seen one that says, well, where did your data come from? Was it your training data, whatever? Like, was it coming from an ethical source? Kind of like single, whatever the stamps you get on your food that
your fair
exactly
trade data.
Fair trade data, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and there are some efforts at this. There's something called the Data Nutrition Project, which is looking to standardize data labels like this. But before that, there was data sheets for data sets, which was a paper I believe was written by Timnit Gebru, who was famously fired from Google a few years ago and has gone on to found her own research institute. Yeah, so there's definitely some movements there around, how do we do better data governance? And I'm hoping too that, it's funny because we've had these issues for a long time, right? Like with famously the facial recognition software that gets used by a lot of police, right, to identify suspects. It's trained on mostly white faces, and so Black people are more likely to be misidentified and falsely arrested. This is something that's happening today, and we probably should have had some kind of checks on that a long time ago. But I think the generative AI is kind of like raising this specter of safety issues, maybe in a more overblown kind of way, but hopefully it will help us sort of walk back and think about, well, what are the just sort of like the things that are going wrong now that we should start addressing. So yeah, I think that, and so maybe with like regulation, there's like some specter of regulation. I know it's pretty toothless right now, but maybe that kind of thing will help people think more about like what it means to evaluate this data for the kinds of behaviors we want the models to have.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any of this if we don't have data, and the better the data is, right? And I mean, that's again coming back to a linguistics background. It's understanding how how to label that data, how to make sure there's semantic meaning and structure in that data that makes sense, and the more that's optimized, the better the outcomes are. So again, garbage in, garbage out.
You know, I also want to say something I learned from the Campion article that I probably is like really maybe obvious to IO psychologists, but it wasn't to me, is that there's this difference between the quality of the criterion data, so kind of, and versus the construct validity. And I had never thought about that as in that framework, but it really makes sense as the kind of thing that we're up against, because with data quality, because it comes down to really two things. The first thing is like whether, because we generally measure our models according to like precision and recall. When you're identifying cats and dogs, how many times does it identify cats correctly? How many times does it identify dogs correctly? You know, what's kind of the false positive, false negative kind of ratios going on there? That's really like kind of the beginning and the end of the ML model evaluation. But that kind of that I think that counts as like, that's just criterion data, though, or criterion validity. It's not construct validity. The construct validity is whether those dogs and cats were labeled correctly in the first place, and whether it makes sense for us to think about dogs and cats in the way that we are, and like kind of these more like general questions about, are we approaching this
Yes,
the right way?
brilliant. You have just connected the dots to wrap us up in a way that's extremely understandable, because they are two different things, and but they need to be the same thing, if that makes any sense, right? Because otherwise, goes back to blast from the past, Landy 1986, foundational article in our field that basically says all validity is the same thing. Don't try to partition it out into different labels. It's all about that. That conceptually a great article, and I'm sure anybody who's gone through school for what we do has read it. If not, go read it. But that's what you've just said connects back to that. So really good stuff. We're running out of time. I could talk about this stuff all day. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to hang out again off camera. Come back out there sometime soon. But just let everybody know. I say this and I say it every time. Let everybody know where they can find you. Obviously, LinkedIn is where people can find them. So plug something else you're doing, or let people know how to get in touch with you to tap into your expertise.
Yeah. So you can find me on LinkedIn. That's the easiest starting point. I do have a website, westvalley.ai, and you can email me at karin@westvalley.ai. It's all pretty straightforward, as you say. I would really, welcome conversations that people want to have about the applications of AI to HR tech or people analytics or any sort of IO fields. I find that really interesting, or anything kind of related. I'm really interested in getting a melding of the minds here going, like we did on a very small scale today, but exactly. Let's really like figure out what each other is talking about and try to make some progress together.
Yeah, I think our stuff's a little easier sometimes than yours, but who knows. Well, cool. Very, very great. Thank you so much. And I'll just play it out here. Listeners out there, you need anything related to talent assessment, ethical talent assessment, Rocket Hire's got you covered. So come find us, and we love talking about new and different use cases, but also doing the good old stuff like job analysis, etc. So look us up. We're here to talk to you about it. Have a good one.
Thank you.
As we wind down today's episode, dear listeners, I want to remind you to check out our website, rockethire.com, and learn more about our latest line of business, which is auditing and advising on AI-based hiring tools and talent assessment tools. Take a look at the site. There's a really awesome FAQs document around New York City Local Law 144 that should answer all your questions about that complex and untested piece of legislation. And guess what? There's going to be more to come, so check us out. We're here to help.